Welcome again to the Municipal Procurement Laws and Pathways training. Today, we are talking about how to procure clean energy technologies and services while complying with procurement laws, and understanding what are the different procurement pathways available to a municipal energy manager. Our learning objectives are to be able to describe the common procurement pathways for energy-related technologies and services, and to understand the procurement process and how to maintain compliance with state laws. So to kick off, as usual, we want to do a couple of introductory polls that we will launch. Is that ready, Samiksha? Beautiful. So please rate your level of agreement with the following statements. 1, I am familiar with the basic procurement rules that apply to municipalities in Massachusetts. I understand when an energy sustainability project requires a formal procurement process. And have you met your chief procurement officer? Let's take 30 more seconds to respond to those. Okay. If you haven't responded, get your responses in, and then we'll end our poll. Okay, so we've got a healthy mix of folks being familiar with basic procurement rules. So glad you are in this training and can expand your knowledge. The second question, I will admit, was a bit of a trick question. If you are purchasing it, you are procuring it, and we'll get all more into that today. Seems like a good amount of folks have met their chief procurement officer, some have not or are not sure, and at least one municipality does not have in-house counsel. Thank you for taking the poll. All right. As I mentioned, we've got lots to talk about today, and we've got some pretty powerhouse speakers for you all. So I'm going to introduce them and then pass over. Our first speaker is Margie Weinberg. She's MAPC's general counsel and oversees all of our legal matters and supports to manage collaborative procurement contracts. Margie's been with the agency for almost 10 years, and prior to joining MAPC, she served as the senior counsel for MassDOT and the RMV for almost 20 years. In that role, she was responsible for procuring goods and services, legal services, including drafting RFI or RFRs, sorry, and developing technical specifications. Margie has a JD from Suffolk University Law School, a master's degree from Tufts, and a bachelor's from Drew University. And then we have Joanne Becerra back with us today. She's the director of the Green Communities Division at Mass DOER, where she manages $20 million annually for municipal clean energy, technical assistance, and project implementation. Joanne has been with the Green Communities Division since its inception in 2009 and has seen it all and has over 30 years of experience working with local governments. And my fun fact from Joanne is in her spare time, she spends time playing with her backyard chickens, which I would love to learn more about. And last but not least, we have Beth Greenblatt, who is the owner and managing director of Beacon Integrated Solutions, an independent energy management solutions firm that specializes in energy procurement, energy management, energy savings performance contracts, and the whole gambit under renewable energy technologies and strategies. And Beacon helps their client optimize energy usage through energy efficiency, infrastructure upgrades, renewable energy strategies, etc. And Beth is no stranger to us, of course, because outside of that role, she's also serving as the consultant municipal energy manager for the town of Agawam. So thank you to our speakers in advance. Our agenda today will be as follows. So I'm going to pass over to Margie in just a second to go over a general procurement overview 101. Margie will tell us about Chapter 30B and statewide contracts, and then we'll pause for Q&A. We'll also pause the recording. And then Joanne Becerra will take over to talk about Chapter 25A, Section 14, or the procurement pathway for municipal energy projects under 300K. Again, we'll pause for Q&A. And then finally pass over to Beth to talk about Chapter 25, Section 11, IC, or 11I, 11C, which is energy performance contracts. Again, we'll pause for Q&A and then wrap up with next steps. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to throw it in the chat and we'll try to get to it during the Q&A. So without further ado, I will pass over to Margie.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I wonder if it's possible if we could see the full gallery, Julia. Thank you. So mine is the oddball communication here because as energy managers, you will all be using 25A as your primary methodology for procurement. But it's always helpful to have a strong understanding of 30B so you can see where there's some intersection and some support that you can get as well. I'll also be addressing statewide contracts, a little bit on federal procurement, a little bit on construction, vertical and horizontal, and on some other things to put in your toolbox and some new legislative opportunities. So I'll try and squish this all in together, but it's important to know that so long as you file your contracts with the OIG, with DPU and the Department of Energy Resources and the Inspector General's office within 15 days of contract execution, then your energy-related services contracts are exempt from 30B procurement. But that doesn't mean that 30B procurement can't be a good tool in your arsenal of procurement opportunities for all of your procurement needs. So I'm just going to give you a quick and dirty overview of some of the basic thresholds for municipal procurement. And remember, these are things you can do for your goods and services that you need to support your 25A energy-related procurement services. So the easiest thing in procurement, and there isn't a lot that's easy in procurement because it's very counterintuitive, is that if you have a contract for less than $10,000, so $9,999.99 is your max, then anything under $10,000 you can procure using what's known as sound business practices. And sound business practices means you have done your research, you have done an internet search, you have looked at statewide contracts perhaps, that you understand your pricing and you understand that you're getting quality. And as long as it is under $10,000, you do not need to seek competitive quotes. You can go directly with the source that you have determined is capable of performing the service in a quality way and is giving you a fair price. And again, that is just market research that you can do through the internet. If it is over 10,000, but it is under 50,000 in value, then it's everyone's most dreaded type of procurement. It's a low bid because it means you have to take the bid from the qualified, responsive, responsible bidder capable of performing the service, even if it's not the one you wanted, because they are the low bidder. Which means when you're putting together your specifications, good to have threshold questions that they have to answer. Do they have a requisite number of years of experience? Have they done a project of a similar size and scope? There's no comparative analysis or criteria in reviewing an under 50,000 procurement, over 10, but under 50. So you have to have really, really clear, fair criteria that isn't meant to drive out competition or direct competition to any particular vendor. So it can't be, the vendor who lives within one block of your location and they're the only ones that you want. You have to have a fair and open competition. You have to send it to at least 3 vendors who are qualified to do the work. And you have to then select the lowest responsive responsible bidder. Again, everyone's most heated way of doing business. That's my husband doesn't like it either. It's just the way it is. And then you get to over 50,000. If it is over 50,000, then you have to do a full-blown RFP. Now that comes with comparative criteria and some odd scoring mechanisms, such as they are either highly advantageous, not advantageous, or unsatisfactory. There's no numeric score. Unlike in statewide procurement, where everybody gets a number and then the highest number wins, you have to have a team score of your evaluation committee where everyone agrees uniformly that this is the most highly advantageous vendor of all of the competitive vendors that you provided who meet the criteria that you provide. It is a fairly arduous task. And if all the stars align and it's a simple procurement for a good and service, it's at least a month. It can go much longer than that, depending on the complexity of your procurement, the number of bids that you receive, and it is a bit of a lift. So it is not a simple process. But luckily, the state has provided municipalities with a more simple process. They've done the work. And in 2016, the Municipal Modernization Act allowed municipalities to purchase off of statewide contracts. Now, if anyone's worked with the Operational Services Division, OSD, you know their entire raison d'etre is to produce large-scale contracts that represent the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as essentially the elephant and the largest buyer in the room to achieve efficiencies and opportunities for all of the potential buyers to be able to purchase off of. They've done the work, they've done the procurement, they've done the contract, and I should tell you, a statewide contract is a very highly advantageous contract for participants, not for vendors, but for those who hold the contract, and give you an opportunity to quickly and easily find vendors who are in the services that you're looking for. And in particular, I'm going to mention several contracts that I think might be valuable to you. And very nicely, I know that these will go in the chat and will go out to you after this session, so you'll have copies of the user guides for your own use. And the first one I'm going to mention is VEH 122. And VEH 122 is to purchase electric vehicle charging and related infrastructure. And it includes some unique things like non-grid tied charging, such as solar and battery and charging as a service. So some new opportunities that have come very recently from OSD and create some unique purchasing opportunity. The other is PRF 69, which is for facilities engineering for on-call services, for energy system engineering. The next one is PRF 74, which is for energy, climate action, and facility advisory services. And you'll find some excellent services on there. And also, these represent a multitude of vendors who have different experience and opportunity. And the rule of thumb with statewide contracts, though not exact for all, so always read your user guide, is that you have to, for contracts over a certain amount of money, you have to put it out to 3 vendors who are qualified in the category of services that you're looking for, but you don't have to take the low bid. You're looking for best value. No statewide contract requires low bid selection. You have to determine what is the best and highest value that you are receiving from the bids that you get. The next contract is an unusual one. It's FAC 116 for lawn and grounds equipment, parts and services. It includes battery operated commercial grade electric lawn equipment. And TRD 01, which is, I just going to put out there, it expires next March, a year from March, but they're doing a new contract in between, and they include electrical services, contractors, solar array inspection, which I should just warn you does not include the purchase of the solar equipment or maintenance and implementation and installation of new equipment. And installation is actually a really important point when it comes to procurement, because as soon as you start banging something in the ground or in your building, you've now hit an entirely new section of law on procurement. Now you're looking at construction. So I always say to myself, am I hucking anything in the ground? Because it's going in the ground or going in a wall, it's construction. And now for horizontal construction, such as trenching in a roadway, that's chapter 3039M. And if it's for a building, a school building, a municipal building, then it's chapter 149. And each one of them comes with its own set of monetary thresholds and requirements. But new in the law, which is, I think, super exciting in the last year, we've seen a change in 30B, 30B section 23, which now allows for the purchase of electric vehicles, electric school buses, and electric vehicle charging equipment to be coupled with installation and construction. It used to be you'd get your electric vehicle and you'd have to get your charging station goods and services, but then you would have to do an entire different construction procurement to implement and install. And that really wasn't reflective of how the world of EVSE works. That the vendors did the work, but they were unable to do so. And what was happening is that municipalities were not following through with some of their purchasing because they couldn't get the construction work done. So very nicely, the Inspector General championed moving forward with a change in 30B, which went into effect last year. And so I'm excited to say we had some, modernization in our procurement law to recognize EVSEs and how the state of the business works. And that was a huge move forward. So I was very excited to see that work. And it has resulted in more infrastructure, electric charging infrastructure, being purchased and implemented and installed across the state. So that was an exciting opportunity. Some other things to think about: federal law. If you are using federal money, always remember federal law comes with federal strings. And federal law is governed under 2 CFR 200.300 and its various procurement sections. And there have been a lot of changes in federal law in the last year, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. And that means you have to read all of your federal grants super carefully because they are subject to consistent changes. Some may bother you and some may not, but they are always buried in links in your grants and they're updated, and you're subject to those updates, whether you're getting a new grant or you're already under a grant. So you need to be familiar with some of the requirements that are coming down from the federal government to make sure that these are things that you are willing to follow through with, and that you have brought this to your councils to make sure that you understand that the federal guidelines come with a lot of federal strings. Now, there have been some changes. Some of the market requirements for supplier diversity have changed in construction, and some of the set-asides for supplier diversity have changed. So you need to be aware of all of these things when you're using your federal funds, if you're using federal funds. If you have not already become best friends with your legal counsels, it's a good time to do so, because there are nationwide preliminary injunctions on the enforcement of some of the federal action that's been taken. MAPC has participated in some of this with the Attorney General's office, and we've been very successful. And in fact, just yesterday, the federal government announced that it was retracting its transportation dollar requirement that states cooperate with ICE. And that just happened yesterday. So some of the stranger things that have come down in the last year are that if you were receiving certain transportation dollars, you were automatically agreeing to cooperate with immigration enforcement. Nothing to do with transportation. And we were successful in getting a nationwide injunction. And the federal government has just pulled out and said that they would not enforce that action. So this is a vastly changing landscape on a daily basis. Always be aware of what your federal requirements are when you're using federal dollars. And I want to address another tool to put in your toolkit, and that is Power Options, which is a nonprofit organization that approaches municipalities. I've worked with them at MAPC to do procurement on your behalf. In some ways, they're a lot like the large national procurement organizations out there, is they present a service to do procurement for you. Their procurement is limited to energy resources and energy purchasing. But as I tell everyone, when you get involved with a procurement organization, you have a duty to make sure that they follow our state's laws, because Sourcewell, NGIP, some of these large purchasing organizations, they did procurement, but they followed their state law, not Massachusetts. And as with all things, we're a little bit different in Massachusetts. We do things differently. And it's important to make sure that whomever you partner with, whether it's an RPA, because we do collective procurement, or it's a Sourcewell as a national organization, or it's Power Options, that they are following the law. And so it's important to engage in that communication with them. They have some tremendous flexibility. In fact, it was their statute and their procurement that gave us the idea to change 30B to allow to bundle construction with EVSE procurement. So I give them huge props for having that flexibility in how they do their work. And that definitely influenced the outcome of our 30B change. But you have an elevated duty anytime you participate as a partner in anyone else's procurement. Because even if you don't do it, you're going to be held to the responsibility of having followed our state laws. My experience with them is that they have had some excellent partners with some really tremendous ways of reviewing energy resources and how to evaluate it. But they're not always the most transparent. So you have to ask the questions. It's up to you always. Ask questions, make sure you're comfortable, and anytime you have questions, go to your counsel or even go to the OIG or the AG's office. They are a tremendous resource to make sure that you understand what your responsibilities will be at the end of the day. Because once you participate, you're held to the legal standard of the law, regardless of whether you did it yourself or you partnered with someone. And again, that applies to RPAs as well. Anytime we do our collective procurement, we have to make sure that we have provided cover for everything we do so that we stand in front of it at the end of the day and we are responsible for it. But you need to make sure you're comfortable with that. You need to ask the questions. You need to say, how does this comport with municipal law, with municipal procurement law or state procurement law? And get the answers. And if you don't understand the answers, get your lawyer to ask the questions. And they've been really forthcoming. They've been very helpful to work with, and they have some really creative ideas about how to approach procurement. But remember, as municipal employees, you may never sign an NDA. Everything you do is presumed to be public. Everything you hold will one day be a public record. That doesn't always fly with certain organizations. And you need to make sure that everybody understands if you have it, it is public. If you do it, the public has a right to know that. If you write it, the public has a right to see what you write, which is why I always caution people in procurement. If you're going to write it down, don't put something that would embarrass your mother on the front of the Herald when they print it later. And it is amazing to me what people will put in the margins of their procurement documents. I've had to turn over documents that speak to, I really hated that tie the guy was wearing. I thought, oh, I can't believe I have to turn that over. But always remember what you write is a public record, and you don't want to embarrass yourself or others later. And so I've thrown a huge amount of information at you about municipal procurement law, state procurement law, federal procurement law, some tools in your arsenal for power options. I've stayed within my 20 minutes. And if you have any questions, I'm delighted to answer them. But I can tell you, you are going to want to take notes when Joanne and Beth speak, because they're really the experts here. And I know I'm going to be taking notes as well.
Thank you so much, Margie. So perfect.
And am I in the slideshow presentation? Great, because I see something different on my screen, so that is good. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joanne Bessetter from the Green Communities Division. Thank you for spending some time with us this morning to talk about my favorite subject, procurement. I'm going to specifically be talking about Chapter 25A, Section 14, which is a provision in the Green Communities Act. Okay. My slide advanced? Okay, great. Like I said, I have different screens up. So This is a lovely graphic that my friend Beth put together on a previous presentation, so I'm stealing it. We are specifically here talking about projects, not an overall, I want to decarbonize my town hall, but I want to put in heat pumps in my senior center or something like that. Chapter 25A allows for what I call streamlined procurement. It's still procurement, but it's a little different for any projects that are under $300,000 or less. The statute also allows for on-bill financing. I'm not sure if any of the utilities are doing this anymore, but that it actually allows for that provision as well. Here's some of the language in the statute. So you can cite it verbatim. And what it allows for is municipalities and other local government entities. So this includes like housing authorities, regional school districts, water districts, etc. Can contract directly with a utility vendor. So here it talks about gas and electric utilities, but we're really talking about not National Grid employees, but National Grid contractors and or their subcontractors to provide these services for energy conservation measures. And it further defines something called total project cost, which is important because this is all the costs inclusive of any incentives or rebates that you may be coming to you. So it's not what's coming out of pocket. It's not what the town is funding out of a Green Communities grant. It's the whole project cost. It's the value of it. So that's an important consideration. And here it references Chapter 149, just a highlight of some of the procurement strategies here. So the reason why this exists is through Mass Save. Municipalities that are in the Mass Save territories, investment-owned utility territories, are eligible to participate in this. I'm not sure if we have any municipal MLP communities online here, but that's an important consideration that if you are in a municipal light territory and you have gas service, you can potentially get some incentives through the gas program, but not the electric program. If you're in a municipal light territory that has no gas service, you can't use Chapter 25A, Section 14, but there's only a handful of communities that applies to. So one of the big questions is who are you going to work with? Unlike working on procuring something through a state contract or even through 30B, you can't just call up Joe's Plumbing to install your heat pumps. You need to work with your municipal utility representative to identify who these vendors are. They have their own procurement processes that are competitive. They issue RFPs every so often to solicit additional vendors to do work for them in a variety of different ways. Each utility has a number of different vendors. Some specialize in certain things, like some vendors, only do insulation. Some vendors only do lighting. Some do soup to nuts. What I've seen also is some vendors will take on some work and then subcontract out other work that they're not specializing in. And subcontracting is allowed. One thing to note is that anytime, and I'm glad Marjorie's here, she can keep us honest, but anytime you do work on a municipal project, prevailing wage must be applied. So it's not, if you hire Joe's Plumber still gets prevailing wage regardless of whatever procurement you do. So, working with your utility vendors, I know, some of you have been on the job for a few months, so you're, hopefully fully involved with the Mass Save program and how to have buildings assessed and so forth. But that's sort of the first step is, working with your utility representative, identifying buildings that need audits or haven't had one in a while that can use a refresh. It's really important to get, pretty recent information on your buildings. If you don't know who to call, that may not apply to you since you have a team backing you up with your between MAPC and the Mass Save folks. You can always contact your regional coordinator to help facilitate these discussions. And you once you identify your buildings and you identify a vendor, you then have the audit done. One thing to note is that the utilities have a number of vendors that do this, and if you feel free to call your neighbors, if you want to go with Acme Lighting, see who else Acme Lighting has worked with, and get some references. All the vendors are good. Some are better than others. Some have different customer service experiences. So just, you're not stuck with whoever National Grid assigns you. You can, select your own vendor. And here's how you sort of go through working with your vendor. They'll assess your building, identify some energy conservation measures. Either you have a grant to help pay for these, or if not, there's some funds available to implement these contracts. And one thing that is beneficial to a lot of communities is that the vendors will often take out the incentive payment and pay themselves versus having the community get the incentive payment, because as you may be aware, any funds that come to the community automatically get deposited in the general fund versus paying for your energy projects. So what often happens is if you have a $30,000 project and the incentive is $5,000, the town will get billed $25,000 and the utility vendor will receive the incentive directly. A little bit about projects. The definition in Chapter 25A, Section 14 has a whole litany of different kinds of projects. It's pretty much anything that saves energy. They've added in a most recent amendment something called decarbonization activities, which of course they don't define. So if it's decarbonizing, we say okay. Energy conservation measures include all the typical suspects that you see on the slide. The statute also allows for renewable energy generation. It's sort of unknown, embedded a little bit. Not a lot of people know about that. And of course, most utility vendors are not solar installers, but we've had a couple of instances over the years where a town really wanted to use this procurement method. And they worked with a utility vendor who worked with the solar installer and subcontracted out the work and passed it on through them. And, it was for a small project. It wasn't a huge one. Also, eligible under this is EV charging station installation, because that's viewed as a decarbonization activity. So as Marjorie mentioned, there's numerous ways in which to get charging stations installed, whether you use a statewide contract, you use 30B, or you could also work with a utility vendor, and I know a number of them do offer this service. One thing to note is that the amendment removed any fossil fuel powered heating. So you can't use 25A Section 14 to replace a boiler or a furnace. So that's important. And some of the vendors are a little not aware of this. So that's something to look out for. So the total project, this is where we start getting to splicing definitions a little bit. And again, it's the whole project, inclusive of incentives. You want to be careful of bid splitting, where you have, I'll use the example of lighting and then lighting controls as two separate projects. That's really a lighting project. The controls are a part of it. So you want to be careful of having vendors get too creative in keeping their projects under that $300,000 limit. So here's an example of how you would contract for hypothetical projects at the library. They have a need for an HVAC upgrade. They also have a lighting retrofit identified. Using Chapter 25A, you can contract for all this work, but it has to be two separate contracts because these are two separate projects, even though it's in the same building. So that's important to know. It could be with the same vendor or with two different vendors. A slightly bigger project at a school. You can use 25A for the insulation and weatherization, as well as the lighting, but you can't use Section 14 for the HVAC project because it's over that $300,000 total project cost, because it's $275,000, and then the incentives are an extra $35,000. So again, just to make sure you keep an eye on all that. Another convenient thing using the Mass Save vendors is they'll process your incentive payments for you. You don't have to apply them. They have a special portal, speed applications. They help with custom incentives. They have their engineering that will help with that. Again, some of them will provide on-bill financing and provide technical assistance. So keys to success: assign a project manager. That's probably you. Maybe also working in consultation with a facilities manager, or if your town has an engineer, just have somebody who is on top of this. Check your references. Maintain communication with your vendor and utility representatives. If you don't hear from your vendor, don't be shy about reaching out to them or your municipal utility representative. Say, hey, Acme Lighting hasn't called me back in 3 weeks. I'm waiting for this, that sort of thing. I encourage communities to use different vendors for different project types, even though Acme Lighting may be soup to nuts. Joe's Insulation may be a really good insulation company, so feel free to use different project vendors for different project types. Some things to look out for. I mentioned bid splitting a bit, but also something that we call project phasing. And this is where you have a larger building. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. You want to decarbonize the whole building, but it's going to cost more than $300,000. So they'll say, okay, we'll do phase 1 this year. Hopefully you get a Green Communities grant. And then next year we'll do phase 2 in a different part of the building. Hopefully you get another grant, and then phase 3 later on. Just want to make sure that communities have eyes wide open for this. First of all, it may not be the best value for the community because you're ultimately doing a larger project that may cost, almost $1 million. You may not get the Green Communities grant, and you may, you'll delay the project savings. and it may not be the best value. We hear often that communities that opt not to go with 25A Section 14 and they go out to bid, they'll get more competitive pricing. So the trade-off is, time, because the procurement process does take time, as Marjorie mentioned. It's a little more involved. It will be 2 steps. You need to procure the design for this energy system and then procure the construction, which it takes longer, but ultimately it may end up be a better value for your community. It gets installed at once and you can enjoy the savings. But it does take time. So that's, you got convenience versus. So just to, have eyes wide open. As somebody who reviews a lot of green community grants, we see a lot of project proposals come in at $299,000. And it's like, is this really $299,000 or, so just want to make sure you're aware of that. Oh, and that's it. Happy to answer any questions.
Screen share. Okay. Everybody see this?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Well, so this has been great so far, at least from my perspective as someone who's been spinning in this orbit for quite some time. Margie talked a lot about how you procure goods and services. Joanne focused on targeted opportunities for individual projects and a streamlined path to it. And a streamlined path to achieve that. I'm going to talk a little bit about, let me just see. Yeah, here we go. A little bit more about comprehensive solutions. So again, I appreciate Julia's introduction. We are a local woman-owned business, certified in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we are also on one of the state contracts that Margie talked about earlier, PRF 74. My focus today is going to be primarily on clean energy solutions, which I refer to as energy efficiency, comprehensive decarbonization solutions, those kinds of things. And as I mentioned, Joanne talked about the sort of the targeted energy efficiency programs. I'll talk a little bit about comprehensive, and then I'll spend just a few minutes, just because there's so much overlap, with a discussion on how to approach some renewable energy solutions in the context of the various procurement statutes that we've talked about today. So similar type of slide. Joanne and I have done this dog and pony, if you will, before. That in terms of clean energy solutions, there's really, it pertains to 25A, 2 approaches a municipality can take. There's 25A Section 11C and 11I. 11C is request for proposals, which requires a very comprehensive solution where you go through a procurement process that results in very specific proposals with guarantee provisions, including cost provisions, as opposed to request for qualifications, which is a slightly higher bar, where the responding firms are required to provide more detail as it pertains to their capabilities and qualifications. So with respect to the request for qualifications, which is a typical approach or a more commonly used approach for energy service projects, because again, it opens up the opportunity to a broader group of qualified energy services companies, primarily because the bar for entry is a little bit lower. They're not expending at risk a whole bunch of technical support up front, but instead are providing detailed information on their company, their methodologies, their approach, their services, and gives you a really good appreciation of what they might be able to do to help you achieve your goals. The request for qualifications is under DOER's regulations 225 CMR 19. It again includes comprehensive due diligence on the firm and its personnel qualifications, and does allow for high-level price discovery. Whereas 25A Section 11C, governed under DOER's regulations 225 CMR 10, includes the comprehensive due diligence on the firm and their personnel capabilities and qualifications, but it requires, as I mentioned, that full technical due diligence through an investment grade audit and submission of project pricing. An energy management service, as known in the statute, is a single public procurement for all turnkey services. So you heard Margie talk about goods and services and Joanne talk about targeted services. This is a comprehensive approach to get to full turnkey services from due diligence through construction, commissioning, and back-end performance measurement. The public entity, through its procurement process, again, it's a competitive procurement, selects and contracts with a private company, what's known as an energy services company, for a portfolio of services, if you will, the conduct of an investment grade energy audit, which is financeable, for the design and engineering of all the projects, for the materials and equipment procurement, for the construction, for full commissioning, training, back end after the work is done, review and measurement and verification that the savings that they're guaranteeing actually materialize. And there is a provision in the statute. If those savings do not materialize, there's a make whole provision that's required statutorily and by contract. And then there's always the option of ongoing maintenance support services if needed. The public entity finances and owns all projects and basically pays the energy services company for all the services they just provided. So it's a pay for performance in the sense of pay for work that's undertaken. They are in essence a general contractor. When the project is complete, the energy services company is fully paid for all of their design and construction services. And the savings that materializes is generally used, if you will, as collateral or as an available funding source to pay off the debt service necessary to pay for the project. And that debt service generally comes from either general obligation bonds or a tax-exempt lease purchase. So the municipality would engage an entity to do these full turnkey services. Once the construction is complete, the services are all paid for, the upfront services, and the savings that are guaranteed in connection with the project is used to help pay for the borrowing costs associated with the project. Again, contractually and by statute, those annual energy savings is guaranteed, and those guaranteed savings is used to pay for the cost over time. So as your utility cost goes down, it's basically being reinvested back into your buildings. It's an energy management services is an infrastructure upgrade and renewal program. It discourages what I refer to as cream skimming. So you're doing one project at a time where you're realizing some savings, but you still have all of those big, high intensive capital cost projects on your to-do list or in your capital plan. This allows you to leverage the low cost items with the higher cost items to generate a project that overall provide and across buildings that to generate a project that provides long-term sustainable savings that can be relied on because of that guarantee provision, rely on to help offset annual borrowing cost. Implementation, as Joanne said, the typical suspects that can be undertaken as part of an energy management services program, or it's also known as performance contracting, are energy and capital infrastructure upgrades that save energy or water, allows for the specific integration of on-site renewable energy, and decarbonization solutions. Again, some of the key attributes of an energy management services project, and again, this is a tool in the toolbox for you, among the others that you've heard, is it allows you to upgrade building infrastructure and increase building efficiency. It allows for full or partial decarbonization solutions. It helps reduce operating and maintenance costs because you have now had all of this capital renewal of your infrastructure in your buildings. It also helps support operating staff productivity, right? If you're able to implement comprehensive energy building management systems, you're empowering your operations and maintenance staff to be more efficient in how they're managing the buildings, addressing key emergencies, but also optimizing energy in those buildings over time because of the tools they now have available to them. And implement, again, renewable energy strategies, but also a key opportunity is improving indoor air quality. We have lots of old buildings, particularly schools. Ventilation is not always super adequate. When you undertake a performance contract, the energy services company you engage, if directed to look at indoor air quality issues or environmental quality issues, they address that as part of the project. Oftentimes that means introducing more air into the buildings. And of course, when you introduce more air into your buildings, you need to temper that air, whether it's heating or cooling. So you may use a little more energy, but under a performance contract, you're able to leverage those strategies against other strategies that have clear energy savings benefits. Okay. There are some general statutory requirements. Again, it is 25A as a statute is under the purview of DOER. You need to provide as part of your procurement process. You develop either an RFP or an RFQ. Once it's in its final form, you need to submit that to DOER along with some compliance documents for their statutory review. And they have 15 business days to do that review and get back to you with an acknowledgement that your procurement meets the statutory requirements. They're not telling you, and I don't want to speak for Joanne, they're not telling you whether it's a good or a bad procurement. They're saying you meet the requirements of the statute. Again, you need to provide that to DOER before it's issued out to the street. Any contract that you engage in with a vendor, an energy services company, also needs to be submitted before execution. After you've gotten all the local approvals, before execution needs to be submitted to DOER, again, at least 15 business days prior to execution. There is an annual reporting requirement that must be met, which is really detailing the results of the performance of the project on an annual basis. And that gets submitted to DOER also 90 days after the first year anniversary and then a subsequent anniversaries. And then any contract amendments that may happen over time for a variety of reasons. Again, this is a full-scale, comprehensive turnkey project where you will execute a contract with a maximum guaranteed price. But for those of us who have done construction over the course of our careers, we know that stuff always happens during construction. So that unit vent that you were taking out of a classroom, that was pretty straightforward until you took it out and you found all kinds of asbestos that nobody knew existed. And there may be a change order to some extent that would appropriately be approved by the municipality in order to fully implement that project. But any of those amendments to a contract would need to be also submitted to DOER before the effective date. Some of the procurement requirements that you want to make sure is included in your procurement, and there's a variety of them, but just at a very high level, a provision of a guarantee. That's the basis of this statute, is that there is a provision of a guarantee in units of energy and cost, and a provision for an obligation to make a shortfall payment if those savings don't materialize as expected. I think one of the things I want to be very clear about is when you hear, and there's lots of programs that have these provisions of guarantees, no one is guaranteeing energy cost in general. right? What they can guarantee is that if they're projecting you're going to save 100,000 kilowatt hours from specific projects or at specific buildings, that they can demonstrate that you actually saved those 100,000 kilowatt hours in that year. The value of that is generally based on an agreed upon rate, because we all have our crystal balls for energy costs, but as much as we're right, we're also wrong. We know directionally, we don't know sort of the magnitude. Also, the ESCO has to be DCAM certified, and they need to provide a current DCAM update statement. They need to provide payment and performance bonds for 100% of the total project cost. Like other statutes for public procurements, prevailing wage rates, the utilization of prevailing wage rates is absolutely required. And they perform all construction and performance period services for a term no greater than 20 years. It can be 15, it can be 10, but it can't be more than 20. So those are sort of some of the, I don't want to say limitations, but some key requirements.
That's sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to flag the time. We have about 10 minutes left, and if you could just save us 1 or 2 minutes at the end to do next steps.
Yep.
Thank you.
So when you're developing a procurement under the statute, be smart, right? You need to meet the mandatory requirements, but there's no limitation of what else you can add, particularly in an RFQ process, request for qualifications. Don't, avoid the fashion show. Everyone's going to look good. You want to make sure that they're going to meet your needs. So you want to provide some enhanced requirements, define what you're looking for, develop a comprehensive scoring criterion matrix, and do some price discovery. Issue additional discovery, more questions if you need better answers to get a better sense of who's going to provide, which firm will provide the most advantageous solution for your community. Conduct the interviews, and then implement your evaluation process, and you rank order your responses from most to least advantageous as defined in your procurement documents. So under this bundled turnkey services, I look at it as there's 4 different phases. There's this technical due diligence phase, right? So you've selected one firm and they're going to do all 4 phases for you. They're going to do the technical due diligence phase, which is the investment grade audit. They're going to develop a sound energy baseline using all kinds of data that you'll provide to them. And then they will do a full investigation of your buildings and conduct and develop a thorough inventory and assessment of your existing energy and building systems. This is for a long-term strategic plan that can be implemented over time. Then there's the documentation phase, if you will, where they provide you this report. And it's very comprehensive because it is, in fact, investment grade, which means you can finance off of it, right? You've got full scope of service, which includes things like the work to be done, the total energy savings and project costs, any proposed renewable energy options, and then a plan to verify that what they developed and what they constructed will provide the savings that they've guaranteed under the terms of their contract. And those guarantee provisions need to be, or the plan needs to be, designed in accordance with the Federal Energy Management Program guidelines. And those are very, very well defined. And I'm happy to share sort of a high-level primer for those folks that really want to dig into it and have some enjoyable reading. But there's a variety of different strategies, and it really balances risk with cost. The less risk to the public entity, the greater the level of cost, because of the greater level of management. The more risk to the public entity comes at a lower cost because, again, less annual measurement. Then you move to the implementation phase, which is construction and commissioning, and technical and functional training. So not only have you had the design, but you're now implementing. You can implement in phases. You can have multi-phase projects. So if a firm identifies $10 million worth of upgrades, you can say, you know what, for this phase 1, we want to do these buildings or these sets of projects. And maybe that's $3 million this year because that's what we can borrow for. So those are the kinds of things that, again, that's part of the strategic discussion. And then once everything is installed and training has been undertaken, the buildings will perform for the first year, and you've now moved into the performance phase, and there will be an annual analysis. There'll be reconciliation and reporting to demonstrate that the savings have been achieved, and if not, the plan for a make-whole provision so that the municipality is not harmed by the lack of savings that should have in fact materialized. That needs to be submitted to DOER on an annual basis, that annual report. Some key critical success factors just to think about: be fully transparent, right? This is a big open public process. You want to do it right. You want to be fully transparent. You don't want there to be any bid protests because there was something that was developed behind the scenes by someone else, and you're adopting something that someone's handed to you that you don't really know the origin of. Be inclusive. Don't beg for forgiveness. Build an internal support team from various stakeholders within the communities, including operations. Facilities people know a lot. Rely on their expertise. Bring in your financial folks because you're going to need to borrow for this. Your administration, and then with respect to the schools, make sure you bring somebody else in from the schools because you'll learn a lot about how buildings are performing and areas of improvement. Select a project champion. As you know, Joanne recommended the same thing, and I'm sure Margie would say the same. That may be you, or it may be somebody else in the in your stakeholder group, and leverage the internal expertise because there is quite a bit internally. Involve the appropriate stakeholders during the initial procurement and selection process, during the technical due diligence, the IGA phase, and then through construction and commissioning. When you have buy-in from all stakeholders, it results in a much better project. Develop initial program goals, including prioritizing capital projects, if that is an objective of yours, and then defining financing and term limitations. So, for example, I mentioned that you can contract for up to 20 years. Your financial folks may say, we would only look at a 15-year borrowing, and here's our borrowing rate that should be built into the financial analysis. So you want to really look at what your constraints, if you will, are to put on an overall program, if in fact that's a necessary requirement. And then again, educate stakeholders and set realistic and achievable goals and schedules. If you're looking to do decarbonization under a performance contract, as we all know, especially if you're looking at geothermal, it's going to be expensive. So getting buy-in as soon as you can in the process and in the selection is going to result in a much better outcome when you go to town meeting and ask for borrowing, or you go to your city council and ask for borrowing. There are, as Joanne said, some available resources on DOER's website. I encourage you to look at them. The sample documents that DOER has might be a little dated, and again, are good starting points for you to look at. I would not pull a procurement, an RFQ, particularly off DOER's website without then looking at it, working with your procurement officer and say, how do we make this ours? Here's all the stuff the state's saying is important to include in a procurement that helps you meet the requirements and makes their review a lot easier. So let's customize that, customize that for our individual community needs so that we have some consistency, because your procurement officers really, or your procurement, I guess, officer is really important in this process. I'll go real quickly. And Julia, if you just give me a second, it gets almost even more, the graph gets more complicated when you're looking at renewable energy solutions. So if you're looking at renewable energy solutions, there's two ways to look at them. The public entity is going to own them, or a private entity will own them. And there's a variety of different paths that a municipality can take. If the public entity, so the municipality, wants to own a solar array, for an example, you can go through 25A, Section 11 CRI, and we've done a lot of those, or Chapter 164, Section 137, also known, I guess, as the power options per statute. And those are comprehensive design build solutions. You could go through, as Joanne mentioned, 25A Section 14 or Chapter 149. Chapter 149 often, most recently, has been used quite a bit as it pertains to new construction. So if you're building a new building and you want to build, the municipality wants to own some of those assets, building those into your 149 procurements tends to be a good option, whether you do it as part of a base, as part of the base, or as alt ads, depending on other factors involving MSBA and some other things. But 149 is not typically the go-to for that one, except if it's being done in connection with new construction, in my experience. If the asset's going to be privately owned by a third party, again, it can be done under 25A 11I or C, 164, Section 137, or another option under Chapter 30B is Section 16, which is disposition of real property. If the public entity is just going to lease out its property and then be a buyer of the energy, you can use 30B Section 16, which is appropriate in certain circumstances and not very much in others. So there are lots of options as it pertains to renewable energy strategies. A lot more detail on sort of what happens with all of this, but if you're using 25A Section 11C or I, that's a competitive procurement where you're going out to bid, again, similar to the clean energy strategies, and all of those services are being provided to the public entity if the public entity is going to own it. If a private entity is going to own it, it adds a few additional requirements, if you will. There will be a requirement of a lease. There will be a requirement of 100%. It's an energy procurement. So 100% of the solar generation needs to be purchased either under a power purchase agreement for net metering or alternative on-bill credits. The selected vendor will require a long-term lease or license agreement. I caution everyone when you are doing long-term leases or licenses on public property to not only talk to your attorneys, but also talk to your financial folks to make sure that if there is any tax-exempt debt on that parcel, if that property or a portion of that property is going to be leased to a private entity, there could be a risk of tax-exempt debt converting to taxable debt. And that is a box on your list of check boxes. You want to check off that you've done your proper due diligence with respect to that particular issue, because the conversion of tax-exempt debt to taxable debt on a building that could have $100 million tax-exempt bond on is a big deal, and in not a good way. So you definitely want to make sure that you've checked off that box with respect to any private use of public property. Again, I mentioned Chapter 30B, Section 16, again, a competitive procurement. You go out to bid. Really what you're doing is you're leasing land or the surface of a roof or the partial surface of a parking lot. Whatever it is, you're leasing land, and the consequence could also be the purchase of the energy under a power purchase agreement. Again, same issue, even with this statute, you need to consider private use of tax-exempt property. There's more flexibility on term. Performance guarantees not required, but recommended in my world. This vendor undertakes design, construction, commissioning, safety training. They own the asset, they operate the asset, they're ultimately responsible for decommissioning it, and they offer the option to purchase the solar generation. It's not always an obligation, it's an option. And then finally, under the section, Chapter 164, Section 137, which is a sole source option, as Margie was talking about. Power Options is a procurement arm. They've gone out and they've procured, but you're sole sourcing to that procurement arm. They undertake design, construction, commissioning, and safety training. If the public entity wants to own it, the vendor may offer optional annual and maintenance services for fees. 100% of the solar generation directly benefits the public entity through the net metering or alternative on-bill credits or If you're spinning your meter backwards, also avoided costs. And the program does include a guarantee provision. If the asset is privately owned, similar to the other procurement statutes, but there is a requirement that 100% of the solar generation is purchased through that vendor, as opposed to integrating it with other types of other entities. Again, same issue of private use on tax-exempt property, because under that program, there is an allowance for a long-term lease. But again, it's a private entity leasing public property. And as a result of that, there could be an issue regarding any tax-exempt borrowing. And again, the program does include a provision for a performance guarantee. And that's it. A lot of information.
Beth, you crushed through so much information in such an articulate way. I'm very impressed. Thank you so much. I know we are over time and we've got some great questions in the chat. So my hope was that I could follow up with you on some of those questions and then we can circulate the responses to the folks. Does that work? Thank you so much. I know we've got a few folks left. I just wanted to flag a couple of upcoming events. We'll send that around in the follow-up email along with the resource that Margie shared. The only new training that we've got scheduled is on February 11th, which is all about the base code, stretch code, and specialized stretch code. We'll have Becca back from DOER to deliver that training. Thank you all so very much. Margie, Beth, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Thanks all. Have a great rest of your days.